Well, about the year 75 AD, the church community for whom St. Luke was writing his gospel narrative were experiencing challenges on all fronts, very much like the world we live in today. There were certain persecutions that threatened to shake their trust and faith. The community ran the risk of being overwhelmed by skepticism and fear, and almost like a certain secularism as they knew it. Unable to understand why it had still so many trials to undergo. In the crises and the disturbances that were afflicting them, and afflicting the physical world and society around them, also troubled their minds and provoked reactions of fear and panic. It sounds so much like the day we are living in. In this context, St. Luke records what Jesus taught his disciples about what to follow him really means and implies. What Jesus said, what he had done, reveal the certain surprising plan of God in which disciples of all times must enter, namely, that God would bring salvation not in the human way of power or wealth, even miracles, but in the divine way of love and sacrifice. The wonderful wisdom of God, who turns the unpromising vulnerability of loving into stunning and lasting victory. So St. Luke is writing these ideas for his own community, his present-day church. And he tells his community this what we must do in our turn, in our time, when we read and listen to the gospel. Now, in last week's gospel, Luke shared with us the requisite conditions for following Jesus, and they are very challenging. Jesus is calling for the single-hearted and undistracted commitment which he himself served others, knowing defeat, always moving forward, not even with a backward glance. Pretty strict conditions, requirements. Today's gospel is like a continuation of last week's, and here St. Luke is giving us the instructions given by the Master to his messengers, concrete instructions addressed to the messengers of the gospel, you and me. And in the light of the society in which we live, given the challenge that we face, I wish to share with you very briefly what being a messenger of the gospel means for you and for me right now. The gospel tells us the workers will always be too few in the huge field of the apostolate. For the apostolate is as wide as the whole world. But remember this, the duty of the messenger, you and me, is to sow seed wherever we go, in our own particular way, in our own particular circumstances, in our homes, being faithful to our promises, our vows, in our community, responsible citizenship, in the church, carrying out our rightful role, and so on. We have to remember that one only gathers fruit that was sown at another time. Jesus says, pray for new harvesters, pray for new workers, but at the same time, be ready oneself to labor if sent. For it falls on everyone to fulfill the mission given. And that's why over and over again, Jesus says, don't be afraid, don't be discouraged. We have to remember that salvation is God's work. St. Paul brings this out in so many of his writings, that we have to plant, we have to sow, we have to witness in our own particular circumstances, but ultimately, it's God who gives the growth. We have to be true to our part, and then we have to have that faith that we put ourselves in God's care. That's why Jesus tells his disciples, "Go forth under the guidance of the Spirit with no other law than that of the love for one another." God's call is double. Worship divinity, link yourself as he did to humanity. Now, I, for one, forget this all the time. I found, as I read this gospel, that it was a faith challenge, at least for me, that I found in my apostolate, in my vocation, in my work. I put so much stock in what I do. I'm grateful for the abilities, the graces, the talents that God has given to me, but sometimes I depend on those more than I depend on God's work. I can tell you, I can be a man of little faith, work harder, self-will, self-denial. I can make life very difficult for myself when I forget about the presence of God, when I forget that I'm doing God's work. Then again, ultimately he's giving the growth. He's giving the grace. Jesus wished his disciples and the people whom they would be serving to become fully aware of their utter dependence on God's providential care and protection. And again, how often I forget that. I think everything is on my shoulders. Everything depends on me. And it's pretty clear here in the gospel. Jesus says, "Trust me. Take my lead." He says, "I send you as lambs in the midst of wolves, with no other defense and consolation than the Spirit, with no other assurance than the promise that you will not be confounded." Boy, if we could only really believe that, if I can only really believe that and practice it. Carry no money bag, no sack, no sandals. In other words, think not of your own needs. But on a deeper level, it indicates that the only equipment the disciple would require would be given them by God, namely courage, grace, and power. On the strength of that equipment, the disciples would be able to preach the reign of God. It seems so simple, doesn't it? We have to take the burden off ourselves sometimes, maybe all the time. Sometimes you hear this saying, let go and let God. Put yourself under God's care, then do the right thing. It's interesting, Friday, I believe, our new Pope, Pope Francis I, is issuing a new encyclical, and I believe it's Lumen Fide, the light of faith. I think it has to do with the year of faith. And I only read a little bit, just some synopsis of it. And it has to do with something I was sharing here about reason and faith and so on. And I can tell you this, I was glad to find that our new Holy Father's encyclical and his teaching is in keeping with what I'm sharing in this homily. It made me very happy. Okay. Well, anyway, I went to this funeral not too long ago, and they were handing out holy cards remembering the deceased. And the words came off that holy card and just struck me. And it really helped me to get into this homily and see this gospel through the eyes of faith. It said, I took this personally, may you rely on God your Father, overflowing with motherly care. The challenge of faith.